He was cocky, a cocky little guy.
He ruined me as a guitar player.
Human relationships are complicated, and inside the biggest band of all time, there were tensions we're still trying to understand today. One of them, maybe the quietest, but also one of the most painful, was the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Over the years, their connection slowly broke down, becoming a key factor in the Beatles' breakup. George developed a growing frustration toward Paul, a kind of emotional exhaustion after years of feeling ignored, underestimated, or pushed aside. And what followed were interviews, comments, and public jabs that revealed a deep resentment toward the boy who had once been his teenage friend, long before John Lennon showed up in their lives. Today, we're taking a closer look at the difficult, tense, and surprisingly moving story between Paul McCartney and George Harrison, and how time eventually helped them heal wounds that once felt impossible to fix. Long before fame turned them into legends, in the heart of Liverpool, a simple school bus became the setting where one of the most important friendships in the history of rock began, the one between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Both attended the prestigious Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, an academic school located in the city center. George hated every minute there. He remembered those years as a dark period, full of orders, punishments, and frustration, he would say. His rebellion was constant. He once even got into fights with other students and reportedly headbutted an older boy. Paul remembered it with a mix of surprise and respect.
He was cocky, a cocky little guy. He had a good sense of himself. He wasn't cowed by anything. Looking back now, it was pre-fame. So you were just an ordinary kid who couldn't get in places because you weren't famous. Teachers didn't like you. Rock and roll hadn't arrived yet.
Paul, on the other hand, was a more disciplined student, responsible, with artistic inclinations. He loved words and had a more refined air than most. But deep down, he shared with George a similar sense of boredom toward formal education, especially music classes. Neither of them saw any connection between those dusty sheet scores and the rock and roll that blared from the radio.
They used to cane us and, 6 of the best kind of thing. But I remember this time, George got caned, George Harrison, because we were mates at school. And, we never really did anything wrong, but we might have, tight trousers and Ted hairdos, and so that pointed you out as somebody, as a troublemaker. So George got done once, and the teacher missed him and got him here, whack. So he had a couple of big wheels came up here, those rash things. And he went home and he's having his tea with his dad, and they're all chatting about how it went at school. His dad said, "What's that?" And he saw these things, and George told him, the teacher did it. So the next day they were in class, and somebody popped their head round the door, the class. Mr. Whoever the teacher was who'd caned George, come out there for a moment, please. And he came out, and it was George's dad there. He said, "Did you do that to my son across the fellow?" I said, "Yes, I did." He went, whack. Oh, he was a hero. He was just the school hero then, George's dad. That was it, but I used to tell my dad, I got caned, Dad. He said, "Well, you probably did something wrong." No help from there at all. Dad, hit him.
The true connection between them didn't happen at school, but outside of it. Both took the same bus heading into the center of Liverpool. Paul began sitting next to George during the rides, and soon those daily minutes became the space where their friendship was born. George's father worked as a bus driver, and often, when the 86 stopped at Mather Avenue to pick up Paul, it happened to be George's own dad behind the wheel. Paul rode for free, a small, everyday detail that became part of the routine George and Paul shared, because even though at school they were separated by a noticeable social and age gap, on the bus it was just the two of them, sharing laughs, stories, and early dreams.
You grew up kind of wanting to go somewhere else. It made you hungry. So art was a great golden vision. So for us that it wouldn't have called it art, then it would be rock and roll.
It was around 1956 when Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel exploded on the British radio, shaking the foundations of an entire generation. From then on, Much of Paul and George's conversations revolved around Elvis, his voice, his presence, his style. George told Paul that his father had learned to play the guitar during a service in the Merchant Navy, and that he himself owned one. Paul, a bit less enthusiastic, replied that his father had given him a trumpet, although he was already starting to suspect it wasn't the right instrument for him. Shortly after, he traded it for a guitar, and everything began to make sense. A year later, Paul and George could already boast of a solid friendship, fueled by a shared obsession: guitars and rock and roll. They spent hours talking about chords and trying to recreate impossible sounds.
In fact, sometimes we'd travel the whole of Liverpool just to go to someone who knew a chord we didn't know. Remember once hearing about a bloke who knew B7. Now, we knew E and we knew A. Those were quite easy, but we didn't know B7. That was kind of the missing part of the link, the other chord, the lost chord. So on we got on the bus, trooped across Liverpool, changed a couple of buses, found this fella, and he showed us dum, 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 B7. We learned it off him, got back on the bus, went home to our mates and went, zing, got it.
Their connection ran so deep that they decided to take a trip together. A small teenage adventure across southern England. With only a backpack each, they hitchhiked, ate canned spaghetti and rice pudding, and slept on beaches and fields. They made it all the way to Paignton and Devon, and then traveled north to Wales, hoping to visit one of Paul's cousins. Their money ran out quickly. So desperate were they that they asked the local police if they could sleep in a cell for the night. When they were refused, they ended up camping near the town's football field. It was one of those experiences that, without knowing it, sealed a friendship for life. By that time, Paul was already part of a musical group led by another young man from the neighborhood. The band was called the Quarrymen. When Paul saw his friend's talent, he quickly thought of George as a potential new member. George already owned a fine guitar, a Hofner President, and could play solos that many in Liverpool thought were impossible. Even so, the position of third guitarist was still held by Lennon's old school friend, Eric Griffiths. Paul began to mention George's abilities to John with subtlety. He invited George to the Quarrymen's rehearsals and performances, where Harrison showed up more as a fan than as an aspiring recruit. During breaks, Paul would insist that if they wanted to be taken seriously as a real rock and roll band, they needed a true lead guitarist, and George was that guitarist. The only problem was his age. He was only 14, 2.5 years younger than Lennon, but Paul's persistence eventually convinced him.
We needed a good guitar player. Both John and I play a bit of guitar, but we couldn't really solo. We weren't that good. And I said, I know this guy. He's a bit young, but he's good.
Despite his youth, George's talent was undeniable, and so the trio was born.
When I was still at school and I was really small, I know John was really embarrassed because I was so tiny. I only looked about 10 years old.
A few years later, would carry the name that would change history forever: the Beatles.
We kind of had a feeling that that's what we were going to do, and that, we just felt that something good was going to happen. But then in those days, something good would just be, getting to do a tour of Mecca ballrooms.
Yeah.
That was like a big deal.
We do like the fans and enjoy reading the publicity about us, but from time to time you don't realise that it's actually about yourself. You see your pictures and read articles about George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Paul and John, but you don't actually think, oh, that's me that I am in the paper. It's funny, it's just as though it's a different person.
In the early years, the relationship between George Harrison and Paul McCartney was close, although differences in temperament and musical ambition were already beginning to show. Both shared a deep admiration for John Lennon, whom they regarded as the natural leader of the band. And when John appeared in their lives, especially during those early teenage years, both Paul and George found themselves drawn to him. As Paul later recalled, he was older and cooler, drank beer, etc. Lennon's presence changed the dynamic. Paul and John began spending more time together, playing and even trying to write songs, while George was left somewhat on the sidelines, as if he were outside that small creative circle that was starting to form. Over time, the Lennon-McCartney partnership became the creative axis of the Beatles. That alliance not only defined the band's sound, but also determined George's position within it. The quiet guitarist, who learned by observing, always looking for his own space between two dominant personalities. Even so, George maintained a deep admiration for John, whom he saw as charismatic and rebellious, and for Paul, whose melodic talent and discipline were undeniable. Within that mix of admiration, distance, and longing to belong, the foundation was laid for the complex dynamic that would shape the story of the Beatles.
When we started doing them, we started apart from each other. You know, John had written one, and I'd written one, I think. And then we just happened to start writing them together, you know. And then I think the reason, for instance, that George didn't write any was that he thought that it was just that we could write the songs and that the other two couldn't. And Ringo still thinks it, I think. But I think anyone can write songs, probably.
Even so, George's contributions added considerably to the Beatles' catalog. He composed the riff for And I Love Her, transformed Norwegian Wood with the sitar, came up with the famous opening chord of A Hard Day's Night, and created the main riff of Ticket to Ride. He was a generous and intelligent collaborator, contributing fundamental ideas to the group's sound. However, as a songwriter, he was long underestimated. George didn't reach the level of maturity that John or Paul had until at least 1966, and realistically, he didn't compete with them as an equal until 1968 or 1969. Still, his best songs were as brilliant as those of his bandmates, even if his output wasn't as abundant or consistent. It must have been difficult, no doubt, to play in a band alongside two such dominant talents, especially while nurturing his own artistic ambitions.
Whether you will go along with any change in taste.
No. Well, you never know, because we have
We
gone along with
don't we?
yeah.
Over time, John and George seemed to connect on a deeper level, musically, spiritually, and culturally. They shared a sharper sense of humor and a growing interest in introspection, art, and new forms of consciousness. Both began experimenting with LSD around the same time, and that experience seemed to strengthen their bond. As the Beatles ventured into more experimental territory, the relationship between Paul and George began to cool. George was seen more often with John and Ringo, and less with Paul, whose attitude in the studio was becoming increasingly dominant. After the end of touring, internal tension intensified. George began to distance himself, especially during the sessions for Sgt. Pepper's The Lonely Hearts Club Band, a project in which he felt progressively less involved. He lost interest in the direction the group was taking and, at times, even stopped attending rehearsals. Meanwhile, Paul grew as a creative force and took control of the sessions, a dynamic that, although it kept the band's artistic level high, also fueled George's frustration, who felt a certain condescension from McCartney. George was supposed to have resented you for always getting on his back. He did resent it. 2 examples. One on Abbey Road. I was beginning to get too producery for everyone. George Martin was the actual producer, and I was beginning to be too definite. And George and Ringo turned around and said, "Look, piss off. We're grown-ups and we can do it without you fine." People like me who don't realize when they're being very overbearing. It comes as a great surprise to be told. So I completely clammed up and backed off. Right. Okay, they're right, I'm a turd. So a day or so went by, and the session started to flag a bit. And so eventually, Ringo turned around to me and said, "Come on, produce." And so it was like, you couldn't have it both ways. You either had to have me doing what I did, which, let's face it, I hadn't done too bad, or I was going to back off and become paranoid myself, which was what happened.
I remember a particular occasion when I'd written Hey Jude, and I brought it in, and I go, "Hey Jude, don't make it bad." And George was playing Hey Jude, don't make it bad. And I had to sort of say, "No, George, look, I really don't think you can put a guitar riff after every line, you know." And it's like a real, "Oh, okay then." But, you know, I knew he couldn't do it. Maybe he knew he couldn't do it, but it created tension, you know, and it was like, then this feeling that I was just dictating things started to grow, you know. And I was dictating things because I knew how I wanted my song to go. Similarly, John would say how he wanted his song to go, or George would say how he wanted his to go.
I'm trying to help you, but I always hear myself annoying you. Should we try it like
Okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, you know, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. No, whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it.
Another factor that irritated George was his limited involvement in the songwriting process. Despite his attempts to collaborate with John, his ideas always took a back seat to the powerful Lennon-McCartney axis. He also felt that George Martin often neglected his songs and arrangements.
The funny position I was in was that in many ways, you know, this whole focus of attention was on the Beatles, so in that respect I was part of it. But from being in them, an attitude came over, which was John and Paul. Okay, you know, were the grooves, and you two, you know, just watch it. I mean, don't forget I spent 10 years in the back of a limousine with them.
In that context, George's resentment toward John and Paul was understandable. For years, he had been underestimated, relegated to a secondary role in both songwriting and the band's major decisions. This scenario was indicative of the troubles Harrison experienced with the band. As Bob Dylan once said, George got stuck with being the Beatle that had to fight to get songs on records because of Lennon and McCartney. Well, who wouldn't get stuck? If George had had his own group and was writing his own songs back then, he'd have been probably just as big as anybody.
We didn't underestimate George. We knew that he was peaking, you know, as we got to those records. He'd not been really interested in the beginning, I don't think. And because John and I did so much of the writing, he could just leave it to us. But I think he realized, you know, that there was something in this, that artistically and financially, it was a good thing to get into. So by that time, we realized that he was really coming up with the goods.
But in time, he began to shine on his own. Songs like Here Comes the Sun and Something, two of the undeniable jewels of Abbey Road, proved that he was on the same level as Lennon and McCartney as a songwriter. George wasn't seeking the spotlight for its own sake, but he was no longer willing to endure the dominance of Paul and John. His artistic maturity and growing self-confidence finally led him to defend his own space. The lack of leadership following Epstein's death, coupled with poor management of the band's business affairs, wore the group down. From Ringo's brief departure during the White Album sessions to George's walkout in the middle of Get Back sessions.
It's a pestering wound, so we've allowed to, and yesterday we allowed it to go even deeper, but we didn't give him anything to do.
anything you like.
See, the point is now, we both did that Joe this time, because of the build-up to it. Now it's
Treat him a bit like that. See, because he knows where I'm about.
Yeah.
I do think that he's right.
Yes.
That's why I think we got the problem, you know. The all of us. You go one way, George one way, and me another, you know.
I just thought, well, what's the point of this? I thought I'm quite capable of being relatively happy on my own, and I'm not able to be happy in this situation. You know, I'm getting out of here.
By the end of the Beatles era, it was clear that Paul and George had very different musical ideas. It was only natural that, with time and the split, they would go their separate ways.
There was also the theory that you attracted more girls by being the quiet one. Was it?
Just a rumor, yeah. I think Paul used to get them all with his, you know.
In All Things Must Pass, George Harrison's debut solo album, one can hear the resentment and frustration he felt toward the dynamic within the Beatles, particularly in relation to Paul. Although the record contains a wide range of songs about spiritual, personal, and philosophical themes, several of its lyrics allude to the tension that existed within the band and to the conflicts with McCartney. A clear example is Wah Wah, where Harrison bluntly expresses his frustration. It can be interpreted as a reference to the communication problems and destructive criticism McCartney often directed toward his music and contributions. The song conveys a rejection of interference and toxic relationships, something that seemed to mirror the deteriorating relationship between Harrison and his bandmates, especially Paul. Another significant track is Run of the Mill. In it, Harrison reflects on how personal relationships can turn cold and distant. The lyrics can be read as a critique of McCartney and other Beatles, who often found themselves trapped in a routine of egos and irreconcilable differences. The relationships among the Beatles were wounded after the breakup, but George's with Paul was the slowest to heal. Despite the constant arguments between Paul and John, those two eventually managed to reconnect between 1973 and 1974. George, however, remained distant. He invited Paul to take part in the concert for Bangladesh, but Paul declined, explaining that because of the legal action he had filed to dissolve the Beatles and his ongoing disputes with Alan Klein, he didn't want his participation to be seen as a Beatles reunion.
A lot of what he says, is pretty right.
Were you invited on the Bangladesh concert?
Yeah, but it's like, don't bother me, man.
Yes, I was invited on it, yes. But for me, it's a long story, all that, because, the thing is, like I say, for me, the only thing is, if I'd gone there, I know for certain, I may be crazy to think it, but I know for certain that it would have been played up as, hey, the Beatles are back together again. It may have only been for one night, but the whole thing would have been perpetuated, when in fact the truth is it's not. It's ended. It has definitely ended,
Even so, there were a few encounters during the 1970s. In 1974, Paul attended a concert from George Harrison's Dark Horse tour, and in 1975, George attended the launch party for Venus and Mars, the new album by Paul McCartney and Wings. Yeah, well, now we don't have any problems whatsoever as far as being people is concerned, and it's quite nice to see him. But I don't know about being in a band with him, how that would work out. It's like we all have our own tunes to do, and my problem was that it would always be very difficult to get in on the act, because Paul was very pushy in that respect. When he succumbed to playing on one of your tunes, he'd always do good, but you'd have to do 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even listen to one of yours. So in that respect, it would be very difficult to ever play with him. But we're cool as far as being pals goes.
He ruined me as a guitar player.
In what way?
He, I don't know. I think it's easier just to read what, because he also seemed to have done the same thing to Henry McCulloch, because I remember reading something that Henry said that he left Wings and he just left it because he said, I don't know if I'm good or I'm bad, I can play this or I can't play anything. So, somebody like Eric, who I rated as a guitar player, that he treated me like a human.
Although the relationship between Paul and George slowly improved during the 1970s, George's bond with John deteriorated completely. Despite having collaborated on Imagine and other projects, their friendship fractured after George refused to include Yoko Ono in the concert for Bangladesh. Harrison explained that the event was meant to be a gathering of rock superstars, not an avant-garde festival, and that Yoko couldn't participate. He's very narrow-minded, and he doesn't really have a broader view. Paul is far more aware than George. He's got an inferiority complex working with Paul and me. George doesn't really know what's happening. The relationship between George and John remained tense until the day Lennon was killed. That unresolved tension surfaced in George's autobiography. John felt offended and told journalist David Sheff, by glaring omission in the book, my influence on his life is absolutely zilch and nil, he said. I was just left out, as if I didn't exist. He remembers every 2-bit sax player or guitarist he met in subsequent years. I'm not in the book. Harrison did mention Lennon several times, though not as a musical influence, which was enough for John to interpret as a slight. It's believed their relationship wasn't entirely reconciled at the time of Lennon's death.
John Lennon said he was really hurt by you, that you'd never mentioned in your autobiography any of the influence that he had on you.
He was annoyed because I didn't say that he had written one line of the song Taxman. But
did you tell him that?
Well, I didn't, because he was already dead after that. But the point to that was that I also didn't say how I wrote 2 lines to come together, or 3 lines to Eleanor Rigby. You know, I wasn't getting into any of that. I think in the balance, I would have had more things to be niggled with him about than he would have with me.
But he said that you idolized him as a young boy, that you thought...
Well, that's what he thought.
And you didn't?
Well, I liked him very much. He was a groove. He was a good lad. But at the same time, he misread me. He didn't realize who I was. And this was one of the main faults of John and Paul.
A quote from Tom Petty, a close personal friend, and a write-up from an article. This is just a guess, but that was the way it appeared to me. He looked up to John so much. He said, "Oh, John would be a Wilbury in a second." Petty explained that Harrison really admired John. Detailing further, Petty continued, "He probably wanted John's acceptance pretty bad, you know?" Even so, George's relationship with Paul improved considerably toward the end of the 1970s. In 1979, they were seen together, along with Ringo, at Eric Clapton's wedding. When Paul was arrested in Japan, George was the only Beatle who sent him a card. "Thinking of you all with love. Keep your spirits high. Nice to have you back home again soon. God bless. Love, George and Olivia." After Lennon's murder, they agreed to work together again. Paul played on George's All Those Years Ago, a tribute to John, and Harrison agreed to collaborate on a song for Paul's album, Tug of War, though that collaboration never materialized. Despite reuniting at Ringo's wedding to Barbara in 1981, the relationship between George and Paul cooled once more. By the mid-1980s, Harrison began criticizing McCartney publicly on television, partly motivated by financial disputes, which created renewed tension within the Beatles circle.
He's okay. He just was trying to use that situation for some personal motive that he had, and it just didn't work. But, you know, we're long past all the squabbles now.
He said that he wanted to tackle some of the other old songs, including possibly some of John Lennon's songs, like Beautiful Boy and Imagine. Does that surprise you that he would do that?
Paul?
Yeah.
Maybe because he ran out of good ones of his own.
Well, now we've got that on record.
Well, it's true. Paul had asked, you know, had suggested maybe the chance of me and he writing together something. And, I mean, it's pretty funny, really, because, I mean, I've only been there about 30 years in Paul's life, and it's like now he wants to write with me, but I think it's maybe quite interesting.
Paul has also suggested that maybe you should write together in the future. Is that on the cards at all?
Yeah, it's not for me, I'm afraid. I think we had our chance to write together for, 25 years, but I'm quite happy now writing with Tom Petty and Bob Dylan.
And he also mentioned the good old suggestion of playing together again, you both. Good idea?
You mean me and Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Ringo a bit?
possibly. It depends really upon, I just like to hang out with people who are friendly, and I was sort of getting friendly with Paul a little bit, but I haven't really known him that well for the last 10 years. If it gets to the point where he's friendly and happy, then we could do that. I don't like to get in a situation where I don't have fun. Paul sometimes is too, he thinks too much of his past.
George said that he didn't really like the CDs because it's sort of, it loses the historical value because it sounds so clear. Do you agree with that?
I don't really agree. I understand what he's saying. It changes the perception of the music.
Of course not.
Hey, big deal, George. Don't make such a big deal about it, man. You know what I mean?
All right. Hey. You know what I mean, man?
You
sound like LL Cool J.
That's right. Robert De Niro. Sure.
Yeah, great. The Godfather.
It is unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket. We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all loved Paul very much. Yeah, for about 10 years I didn't really...
10 minutes.
I didn't really know Paul, and never really saw much of him through the last 10 or 12 years. But more recently, we've been hanging out and getting to know each other, going for dinner and meeting and having a laugh. And it's absolutely not true what they said in the News of the World. It's definitely just one of those things that these people sit around and think, let's have a fight between, you know, George and Paul now, you know. But actually, I love Paul, he's my mate, and it doesn't matter what they say in the papers, it's not gonna, you know, they're not gonna get much mileage out of that one. It is difficult when 4 people are telling the story because it's actually 4 different stories. I mean, you must realize it's got to be somewhat of a compromise when 4 people are involved. But we're trying to just say how it felt to us.
Throughout the process, George's attitude toward Paul was sometimes passive-aggressive, especially during moments when the 3 surviving members interacted.
Hello, Neil. How are you? Hello, George. Nice to see you. Hello, it's a vegetarian leather jacket. Yeah? Yes.
It was a ballet shop, wasn't it? Anello and David was ballet, made ballet stuff and tutus and shoes. It's where all the little girls went. So we'd be getting our Beatle boots made, and there'd be little ladies with their children, you know. No, you had the tutu. I never had one of them.
All that Hendrix, feedback, Jimi Hendrix.
It probably was actually, you know. Well, you know, once you see somebody. Remember going down to a film show in the village?
What was that?
Did you write anything, George?
Even so, Paul eventually agreed to George's conditions, including having Jeff Lynne as producer. The result was a success. There were no further conflicts between them. In fact, their friendship began to blossom again, this time from a place of maturity and peace. But actually, I love Paul. He's my mate, and it doesn't matter what they say in the papers. They're not going to get much mileage out of that one. We're right on the point now, I think. The best time we've ever been at, in order to get all our past problems solved. Plus the fact that we've spent a lot of time with meetings with Paul, having dinner, and just being friends. The last years of George's life were marked by a renewed closeness with Paul. When Lennon-McCartney passed away, Harrison attended her funeral. Not long after, one of the most memorable photos of the 3 surviving Beatles was taken during Ringo's 60th birthday celebration in July 2000. The image, captured by Patty Boyd, shows the 3 of them smiling, at peace, genuinely happy to be in each other's company. They were also seen together in Las Vegas, attending Cirque du Soleil's O in 2001. George Harrison's home had originally belonged to Sir Frankie Crisp, who had carved proverbs into its walls. One of them read, "Scan not a friend with a microscope glass. You know his faults, now let his foibles pass." George loved that saying. He even quoted it in his song, The Answer's at the End. He used it especially to describe his feelings toward Paul McCartney. Human relationships are complex. It doesn't seem that they ever truly hated each other. They simply clashed because of their very different personalities, and because both, in their own ways, were a bit egocentric. Paul wanted things done in a specific way, while George sought more freedom. But once the problem stopped being about music or business, they were able to reconnect as true friends. They may not have always worked well together as bandmates, but they did as human beings. George and Paul had been a part of each other's lives from their teenage years until nearly 60. In any friendship that begins so young and endures for so long, it's only natural that there will be moments of distance, conflict, and reconciliation. What truly matters is that the friendship survives. These were George's last public words about Paul, shared during a Yahoo chat in 2001.
What do you miss the most about George?
His humor, his friendship, his love.
That's it for now. Thank you for being here. And if you're new to the channel, I'd love for you to subscribe. I'm Blake Korick, and this is Music Box.